They are all true. They all happened in or on the edge of the woods, and none of them leave you with tidy answers. There's a sound that trees make at night, like the world is exhaling and holding its breath at once. That's the sound you'll hear beneath these stories. A low wind through pines, a radio that won't stop cracking, a boat engine breaking the dark at the water's lip. If you're sensitive to tense scenes or real-world fear, this episode may not be easy. Listen with care. Blackwood National Forest, October 2012, reframed as Edge of the Woods. My name is Mark. I was 28, a ranger on patrol the year Tom disappeared. We worked in teams of two. Two makes sense when you're hiking out of range of cell towers, when a single snapped ankle can mean days of waiting for help. Tom and I had been partners for 2 seasons. He knew the trails like they were stitched into his memory, the old logging roads, the trout ponds, the places deer liked to bed. He was the cautious one. If he told you to watch a steep drop, you watched it. On a Tuesday afternoon, we split to cover more ground. I took the West Loop. Tom took Deer Hollow Trail, the narrow path that curls into a pocket of younger pines and wet black soil, an area people sometimes report losing sense of direction in when fog rolls. We agreed to check in every hour on the handy-talkies, standard procedure. Our first few calls were normal, the snap of static, the rustle of Tom's breath. At dusk, I heard his voice break on the line and say, "I've got movement, hold position." We agreed we'd meet at the old service bridge. I never saw him at the bridge. Night came down fast. I radioed, then again. His last clear transmission was a small thing, a complaint about the cold. Then nothing. The call signaled and cut. Static filled the speaker like a swarm. I walked until my flashlight hit wet trunks and black glass of the creek. I called his name until my throat ached. We launched a search the next morning. Deputies, volunteers, a tracker dog. We combed the hollow itself, the ridgelines, the water runs where someone could have slipped. We found his pack tossed under a cedar sapling, waterlogged maps, a thermos knocked but not broken, and one walkie-talkie smashed against a rock so hard its plastic buckled inward. No blood, no footprints that led away from the immediate area. The smashed walkie was covered in a fine mud. Whoever or whatever had pounded it down had left no other traces. The dog dipped his nose, whined, and refused to continue past a point where the ground slid into thicker roots. 3 nights later, I was at the station, too wired to sleep. The radio in the dispatcher's room sat on a small wooden shelf next to a stack of long-forgotten incident forms. It snapped to life with a crack and a voice I knew in the marrow. Tom. Not the bright, steady Tom. This voice was ragged and thin, like a strand that had been pulled too hard. "Mark." Static. "He's going to kill me." Then a riverside hiss of white noise, a word torn off, and the line went dead. We replayed the transmission until the sound blurred. He? Who? The forest itself? Someone out there? The message came from a frequency we scanned hard to verify. There was a slight location ping, Deer Hollow. We sent teams back out under headlamps. We scoured the creek, turned over roots, waded the shallows until cold water bit the edges of our gloves. Still no body, no clear sign of a second set of prints. There were patches of the forest where the leaf litter had been disturbed, as if someone had dragged something, but nothing conclusive. The walkie we'd found remained a puzzle. Tom's unit, smashed, and yet his voice had come through a dispatch receiver 3 nights later. The receiver's digital log showed a weak transmission at 0217. We could not find a source. Days stretched into a week. The county brought in specialized teams. We interviewed hikers who'd been in the hollow 2 weeks before. They remembered hearing someone call for help near the old bridge, but nothing more. There were rumors, a poacher's trap, a fugitive passing through, an animal attack. None fit cleanly. A single piece of clothing, Tom's knit cap, turned up snagged on a branch miles from the hollow, but its path to that spot could not be reconstructed. The air in the station was the smell of coffee and tiredness. People took different threads from the same facts. Some said Tom ran from something human. Others tilted towards something less explained. I kept thinking about that crackled voice. He's going to kill me. 3 simple words, the kind of sentence that doesn't leave room for anything else. I left the service a year later. The official files eventually went cold. A missing persons case, unresolved. People moved on in time. Memorial, plaque, a small wreath in spring. But the hollow stayed. Nights I dreamed of a shadow moving through hedge and trunk. I woke to the same silence the trees keep when they hold something in their roots. When people ask me whether I believe the phone call was a hoax, I don't know. It could have been. The frequency could have been hijacked. But the way Tom's name came through, how the dispatcher's monitor picked up a pattern that belonged to him and to no one else, I still hear it when I close my eyes. That radio sound is a physical thing now. It lives in my chest before sleep. The forest took him in a way that left a voice behind. Lake Wister, July 2018. Reframed as Cove Hemmed by Pines. We were supposed to be safe. Cheap cabin, last-minute road trip. Me, Jenna, and 2 other college friends. The place sat on a small cove that the map marked with a dotted line. An inlet so narrow trees leaned together and kept the current shallow. The dock creaked like an old tongue. We arrived late. The whole bay smelled like damp leaves and something older, the way lake water has a memory of every rain it's held. The first night, someone on a boat idled near the far bank and kept their lights off. We joked about boaters sleeping, about people fishing late, but the jokes got thinner as the night lengthened. The engine hums sometimes came without a clear source, a low buzz that rose and fell like someone breathing through a thin wall. The next morning, footprints ran from the water up the bank and onto our dock. Fresh prints, bare feet, toes splayed in the soft mud. They went straight from the waterline across the weathered planks and ended at the edge of our back door. We found the spare key, the one we'd always bury under a clay pot by the stoop, missing. The pot had been shifted, soil next to the plant disturbed. The key was no longer where we put it. We thought we'd been victims of a prank. College kids do foolish things. We chalked it up to a local looking for a drink or a place to warm up. That night, someone revved an engine out in the cove. The boat's light never turned on, but the sound threaded across the water and then stalled right in front of the dock. Jenna looked out and swore she saw a silhouette moving at the bow, but up close, the blackness of the boat could have been any person huddled against the cold. We decided to stay put, to lock the doors and call for help if anything escalated. We sat in the living room, all blankets and shame, making coffee and pretending we weren't terrified. At one point, someone shone a flashlight across the cove, and a pair of red eyes, reflections from a gull, gabbled back. I kept checking the back step, the one the prints had led to, waiting for another set of marks to appear. A week after we left, news trickled in through a friend's feed. Fishermen found a body tangled in nets near the mouth of the cove. The article said little. A man, mid-30s, no ID recovered at the time. Locals said the nets were commercial and often moved overnight. They said sometimes currents took things east. We looked at the photo in the paper, grainy, a face half-masked by algae, and tried to reconcile it with the sober, ordinary world we'd left. The police report I read later, in a printout I kept, was slim. Missing person, possible drowning, no signs of foul play listed in that summary. It was a thin set of phrases for the way the water had felt alive that week. We never knew whether the footprints on our dock belonged to that man, whether the boat that idled at midnight had anything to do with the body found days later. But after the article, the rental listing disappeared. The owner posted a vague apology and a line about updates to property. The cove's calm stayed the same when I drove by years later, trees leaning in on both sides, like someone listening. But in my head, any quiet water now carries weight. Idle engines, nets full of things the current won't lend back. That trip changed me. Nighttime sounds on the road, the steady pulse of a distant motor, felt like a hand on the wheel at 3 a.m. I lived with a thin worry that wherever you see an amber light vanish into trees, there may be other absences underneath. Hollow Ridge, September 2016, reframed as House on the Edge of the Woods. My sister was 11, I was 17. The house sits with its back to a stand of maples that swallows the sound of cars, so at night the world outside our windows feels like a dark throat. It began with a knock. I was babysitting. Dad was away on a 2-night job. A man stood at the edge of the yard holding a paper bag and wearing a hoodie. From beside him, a woman called out, "We're just doing a delivery test." The bag smelled faintly like coffee. The man's eyes were focused on the back window, where my sister was coloring. He had the practiced smile of someone who's made this move before. I didn't open the door. I told them my father wasn't home and that we didn't need food. He asked if we could spare a phone to call our dad. She stepped up with a soft voice and asked if she could come in for a second and use ours. The man stayed near the gravel, watching the bushes in the yard like he was keeping time. I recognized the trick from a friend at school who'd shown me a video. One person distracts the door and another slips in. I called 911 and told the dispatcher everything, the way the operator asks you to. Calm, precise. The man's shoulders tightened. For a moment, the woman smiled like she was apologizing for a mix-up. They walked off. But we saw him the next evening, standing by the lamppost across the road, hands in his hoodie. He did not move even when we drove past. He simply watched our house from the margin of the woods. Neighbors called it a creep. The police logged it. The dispatcher said they'd keep an eye out, but told us not to confront strangers. Weeks later, someone reported a similar attempt 2 streets over. A door opened a crack for a package, and a pair of masked men slipped in behind the delivery person. The residents were lucky, no one hurt. I kept thinking about how close we'd come to giving a stranger entry to our house. The man watching the backyard had been patient, like someone who expects doors to open eventually. The worst part wasn't even that image of him standing in the scrub, but how small everything else felt afterward. I stopped sleeping with the back door unlocked. My little sister knew to go to the bedroom and hide under the covers until Mom could come home. The house's edge into the trees, a line of dark that had seemed like nothing before, became the place where danger could stand and watch. And that watched shape started to show up in every place that was supposed to be safe. It's hard being a teenager and feeling afraid of the world outside your window. Sevierville, May 1994, reframed as farmhouse adjacent to woodline. My name is Hannah. My partner's name is Bunny. We found the farmhouse listed at the edge of a county road with a woodline behind it, advertised as quaint and secluded. The photos showed a long hallway, an old cast-iron stove, and a locked door at the end of the hall. The listing noted unique features in a way that didn't mention the smell of must that lived in the photographs. We arrived with a U-Haul loaded with mismatched furniture and a naive idea of rural charm. The owner, Mr. Doran, handed us keys and said he'd be back in a few days. The interior door at the end of the hallway had a heavy bolt on the inside and big gouges along its frame, scratches that looked like someone had taken a fist to the wood. Mr. Doran laughed it off, said old houses have quirks, that noise travels in older structures. We told ourselves the same. First night, dragging noises in the hallway like something heavy being shifted. A slow, consistent thud that started around midnight and then stopped. We chalked it up to pests, to the house settling. But the next night, the dragging started again, louder, scratchier. I lay awake listening as if I could measure the rhythm. The sound moved along the hall, paused outside the locked door, then receded. We found fresh scratches on the other side of the door the following morning. Long, shallow marks like fingernails or claws. Notches that hadn't been there the day before. Something had been touching that door. Bunny pressed her ear to it and swore she could hear an indistinct scraping from within. We called the owner, who shrugged it away and suggested animals, raccoons perhaps. We called the sheriff's non-emergency line. They said they'd send someone by to take a look, but the deputy told us that people in the countryside heard all sorts of noises, and most of them had easy explanations. A neighbor later said there had been a tenant years before who bolted that door from the inside and never explained why. The man had left abruptly. One night, the dragging was accompanied by whispers, at least that's what Bunny said. She insisted she heard syllables, but muffled, like someone speaking from under a blanket. I woke up and saw the silhouette of something large, flat, against the glass of the kitchen door, like a shape timing its visits with the house's sleep. We gathered our keys and left in the dark with only a single bag between us. We never got our deposit back. Mr. Doran's voicemail went unanswered. The deputy we spoke to later offered the raccoon explanation again, and for months afterward, Bunny would flinch at the sound of a branch on the window. She stopped taking late shifts and began sleeping with a lamp on in the hallway. There is a particular terror that comes from being told you are safe in a place that keeps showing you otherwise. The house looked quaint in daylight. In daylight, you could scrub the margins of it and show other renters that everything was fine. At night, something at that locked door communicated in the only language houses have in the dark: noise, scrape, thud, a slow attempt at a promise or an insistence. We left the place behind and tried not to say its address aloud anymore. If these stories are ringing a bell for you, if you've been in a place where your front door becomes a question mark, tell us below. We're collecting anonymous accounts for future episodes, and we want to hear from people who've smelled the same old damp, heard the same drag, seen the same distant light that won't stop. Share it in the comments or use the submission link. We read them all. I'll come back with more. The woods are patient. They hold the rest of the traces. Hollow Ridge Story fades into low wind through pines. Soft SFX. Distant owl. Dalton House, March 2011, reframed as House Opposite a Woodline. My name is Eric. I bought the little two-story because it sat on a quiet lane and because the backyard sloped gently into a stand of tall oaks, perfect for my dog. Perfect for the mornings I like to drink coffee on the deck. There's a narrow house across the road, set back behind a row of cedars and half hidden from the street. People in town called it the Dalton Place. It had been empty for a long time. The first time I noticed something off was the way the upstairs porch light came on at exactly 2 in the morning. It wasn't a flicker that happened once, it happened 3 nights in a row. Every night at 2, the second-floor bulb snapped from dark to a bright, small pool of light that cut through the trees like a signal. I thought it was a timer. I thought maybe the owner had an old clock installed. But why exactly 2? I set up a cheap camera, one of those motion-activated tripods you can purchase for wildlife. Reframed to fit the story we're telling here, I placed it on my porch, facing the Dalton house. The trees between our yards thinned the view to a narrow window. I wasn't planning to catch anything dramatic. I wanted, selfishly, to prove to myself I wasn't being ridiculous. The third night, the camera caught movement at 1:59 a.m. At 2 a.m., the bulb snapped on. The footage showed a shadow moving in the upstairs window, long, elongated by the angle of the light. Then, impossible, the shadow lifted what looked like a long arm and waved. It wasn't a human proportion. The frame at 2017 froze on something tall and thin leaning out of the window, and this is the part I still replay. The silhouette raised one hand, like a little casual wave in my direction. The clip ended with a flash of light. The camera's timestamp registered the flash at 02:09 and then went black. The battery readouts were normal the next morning, but the clip contained a frame where, for an instant, something close to the lens showed what looked like a face. Too close, blown out by the flash, no shape, just eyes and a smear. The night after I watched the clip with my neighbor, my house lost power at exactly 2 a.m. Every light went out at once. The road lamps stayed on, Only the circuit in my old house clicked dead. I went outside with a flashlight and walked to the edge of my yard where the grass met the woods. In the dark, across the road, the Dalton house sat quiet. Its windows were black. No glow, no movement. The street felt wrong, like a town that had decided to stop paying attention. I called the local sheriff. They came, took copies of the footage, and sent an electrician the next day. The electrician reported finding the bulb socket chewed and a hairline crack in the windowsill outside the upstairs window. There were smudges on the sill, too high to be from an animal. They took fingerprints and swabbed for DNA, but whatever had been on the wood either wasn't human or left no trace that could be matched. The officer politely told me there was likely a transients party or kids using the house. The electrician shrugged and said old wiring acts up. They left me with polite, plausible reasons and the memory of the face blown against the lens. Weeks later, I got a call from the officer who'd taken the report. "We found something," he said. "Not much, but a trooper noticed scuffs where a ladder might have been placed, and," he paused, "your neighbor's motion light had been wired to a cheap timer, but it was an aftermarket job. Whoever was here knew the wiring well enough." The more I learned, the less certain I felt. The scuff marks didn't lead to any sidewalk or path. They stopped at the edge of the back porch and then bled into dirt. There were no footprints in the soft ground that matched anything we could find. The camera's close-up frame, the one with the face, when enhanced, looked less like a person and more like a smear of condensation or the overexposure of light on a curved surface. All the technicians offered explanations that fit one small piece of the puzzle and left the rest cold. The house stood empty for a while longer. I slept with my curtains closed, and though rational thought told me the Dalton place was a simple empty building, I started to notice the trees more than I ever had. They seemed to make a corridor of silence that seeped across the road. When neighbors came by, nervous and curious, I showed them the clip. Some laughed uneasily. Others made a sound like they were swallowing glass. 2 months after the camera footage, a neighbor reported seeing a figure at the second-floor window, much like the clip, but this time it was daylight. A tall, thin silhouette that looked at them directly and then ducked behind the curtains. The police went to the Dalton house and forced an entry. The rooms were bare. Dust lay in the corners. Someone had smashed a bulb and left the broken shards on the floor. They found no one living there, no beds, no chairs, and no ladder. But in the upstairs bathroom, scuff marks ringed the sill, just like the electrician had said. The sheriff noted a single smear on the inside of the window, like someone had touched from the inside and then wiped away quickly. When you live beside an empty house and strange things begin to happen, the brain makes wild bargains. Maybe kids were messing. Maybe a homeless person had been staying up there. Maybe the image was a trick of light. I tried those scripts until I couldn't anymore. My nights filled with the sense that someone had once used that window to look out and say a small, private thing to the woods. The thought of a person, of anything, waving at me from a darkened room felt intimate and invasive at once. Eventually, I sold and moved 3 counties over. The buyer asked why I was selling. I said simply that it felt time. I left a copy of the clip with the realtor and told them if anything else happened to call me. They never did. A few years later, I heard the Dalton house burned in a small kitchen fire. I don't know if that's true. These stories drift. But the image of a hand lifted at 2 a.m. lives inside me like a fossil. I still, sometimes, start awake and look across a room as if I might catch a light turning on where none should be. The trees carve silence into boundaries. Sometimes we find only images, and the image finds us back. Next, a long stretch of 2-lane road hemmed by trees and a driver who met something that stayed too still. Route 33. The 2-lane stretch is reframed as tree-lined route, contiguous with a patch of woods. My name is Lewis. I drove a white delivery van for a courier company. Most nights I ran a route that took me down a 2-lane road. The trees there grow close, maples and birches, and their branches knit overhead so the moon can't do much work. The asphalt was peppered with tar patches. There were no shoulders, just a shallow ditch and a tangle of leaves. It smelled like diesel and cold metal at 3 in the morning. One night in late October, fog had rolled in low. I just dropped a box at a remote house whose driveway vanished into trees. My dashboard clock flickered, then stuttered, as if it couldn't decide what time it was. The radio played a station that kept breaking into static. I remember humming a song I didn't know the words to, just to keep my hands moving steady on the wheel. The van felt heavier, like something about the air put pressure against the windshield. About half a mile down the road, a figure stood at the edge of my lane. It was a person at first glance, or at least shaped like one, tall, impossibly still, eyes reflecting my headlights. It looked like a scarecrow dressed for a funeral. Long, thin, no movement, just standing. I slammed the brakes so hard my head hit the headrest. The van shuddered. The figure did not move. It did not blink. It seemed to be waiting to see what I did. I eased the van forward, thinking it might step aside. Instead, it took a single, deliberate step into the road and turned its face, if it had a face, toward me. The radio shifted to nothing but white noise, and in the interference, there was a voice. It wasn't a voice you could call a human voice. It was a pressure in the air that pushed syllables into the van. "Turn back," it said. So soft I could have mistaken it for the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. "Turn back." My hands were clenched. The engine stuttered once, then again. The right headlight dimmed. Something thumped lightly against the side of the van. 3 measured knocks, like knuckles tapping on sheet metal from the outside. I checked the mirrors. Nothing moved in the tree line. I moved the van forward like I was walking through a dream. The figure remained, perfectly still, and then it was gone. One heartbeat, an empty space where it had been. I pulled over on a gravel turnout and called dispatch. They told me to stay put, which I did, heart pounding so hard I thought it might lurch out of my chest. When an older tow truck finally came by, a man named Hank who ran late-night road services, he looked at the side panel of my van and found scratch marks along the metal, shallow but long. He swore it looked like someone had dragged a branch down the paint. He asked if I'd hit a deer. I said no. I told him about the figure. Hank listened and did not laugh. He told me that stretch of road had been the subject of whispered stories for years. People swore they'd seen someone standing there who didn't move, who watched drivers until they drove away. He shrugged and gave me a lighter smile. Old roads have old eyes. The company ran the van through a mechanic's inspection the next day. They reset the wiring, replaced a fuse in the dashboard, and found nothing else mechanically wrong. The scratch was real. They logged it, filed a minor damage report, and I signed the paper. After that night, I never drove Route 33 at night again. I asked to switch to daytime runs. My manager thought I was being dramatic, but agreed. The sleep you earn from not watching a figure at the edge of the trees is real. The thing that gnaws at me now is the voice in the static, the way the radio chose that instant to speak to me. I sometimes wake to the sound of white noise in my ear, and my hands remember the feel of the wheel when you think something is going to step into your lane. I told friends. Some said I must have been exhausted, that fog plays tricks, that cold air warps light. I told my girlfriend, and she looked at me like someone who had seen the same film too many times. Months later, a coworker called and told me about another driver who'd had a similar run-in only a county over. Van knocked by something, radio choked with static, a figure that didn't move. He changed his shift after that. People trade stories the way they trade recipes. Each one softens the edge, but keeps the shape. I left the job 2 years later. Part of it was a better offer. Part of it was the memory of those 3 knocks and the whispered "turn back" lodged like a stone in my throat. When I pass an old 2-lane road, I still feel the trees close in. Sometimes, driving at dusk, I glance at the shoulder and imagine a silhouette there, patient as a tree, waiting for someone to answer. The woods tighten around small lives and hold them. For some, it's a knocking at the skin of their world. For others, it's a shadow pressing at the window. Next is Sophia's story, 14, alone, and listening to someone breathe at her door. Sophia, June 2014, reframed as teen home alone on the edge of a suburban woodline. My name is Sophia. I was 14 when it happened. We lived in a small house at the back of a cul-de-sac with a pine strip behind the fence. Nothing like a deep forest, but thick enough that at night you couldn't see into the backyard. My parents worked late that night. There was an extra thunderstorm in the forecast. I thought it would be a boring, wet evening. Homework, a pizza box, and Netflix. Around 11, someone knocked on the front door. I didn't think much of it at first. People sometimes mistake houses at night. I peeked through the blinds and saw a dark shape on my porch, too tall to be harmless. It stood perfectly still. I didn't open the door. I told myself to be brave. I called Mom. No answer. I called Dad. No answer. The knocking started again, louder this time. It sounded like someone testing the wood, the kind of knock that asks if someone will answer. A few minutes later, there was a rustle at the back of the house, a soft scraping noise near the sliding glass door. I crept to the side window and peered out. A figure stood by the back tree line, its head turned toward the house as if listening for a heartbeat. It wasn't moving. It was just there, the way something waits outside the frame of a portrait. My hands shook as I dialed 911. The dispatcher was calm and told me to stay on the line, to lock every door, and not to open anything. They said officers were on their way. The knocking grew more insistent at the front door, and then, worse, there was a metallic rattle at the back door's deadbolt. Someone was trying to force it. I could hear breathing separate from the storm, slow and deliberate. When the police car pulled into our cul-de-sac, the figure vanished. Officers searched the yard and the tree line. They found prints in the mud by the backyard fence, rough, boot-like prints, a size that would fit an older teen or small adult. The prints stopped abruptly at the edge of the yard and did not continue into the undergrowth. Officers found marks on the back door's frame where something had been wrenched at. They dusted for prints and took statements. I sat in the squad car and tried to breathe like a person whose chest had been opened and carefully sewn back together. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood for days. They found nothing conclusive. The prints were smudged from the rain. No arrests were made. My parents came home early and held me like a weathered doll with seams between us I could feel. I had trouble sleeping for months. Every house sound had the potential to be the same knock. When the wind blew just right and the fence creaked, I would jump and check the doors. School became a hollowed place for me. I stopped taking after-school theater because the stage exits led to a dark alley. I stopped texting friends back immediately because I was afraid someone could be watching. My parents installed motion lights and a security system. The police recommended a neighbor keep an eye on the yard if we were alone. We moved 2 years later for reasons that felt silly to explain. To a real term, a move was a desire for something bigger or better. To me, it was the trees in the backyard that reeked of waiting. I didn't want to end with a terrifying detail. The thing that stayed with me was small and intimate. The way my 14-year-old hands hovered over the phone, the way a woman's calm voice on the line told me to lock the deadbolt and count the seconds until help arrived. There were no dramatic arrests, no explanations. There was only the knowledge that someone had tested the threshold of my world, and that threshold now felt like an answering machine that could be listened to by anyone. Fear leaves a geography. It redraws a child's map of safety, and sometimes the lines never quite return. Our final true account tonight is about someone who should have been familiar, a face turned violent. Because sometimes the most dangerous things are not out in the trees, but the ones who followed you home from school. Austin. Indefinite date, reframed as Edge of the Woods driveway incident. My name is Claire. I was in my early 20s when it began. I knew Austin through high school, He'd been a casual friend, someone who'd offered rides or joked in the hallway. After graduation, his attention turned into something else. He started showing up more often than I expected. He began to message me constantly. He would appear at places I visited without telling me he was coming. At first, I thought it meant he cared. Later, I realized it meant he didn't understand boundaries. The first time someone mentioned through a friend that Austin had been taking photos of my house, I laughed. When I saw the pictures, taken from the edge of the woods behind my property, I stopped laughing. In the photos, I looked small. Me at the mailbox, me in the driveway, my car missing the day it had left with a dent in the bumper. The woods framed them like a backdrop. I told him to stop contacting me. I changed routines. I blocked numbers and accounts. For a while, the behavior stopped. Then he began to slip into places he could be legal. He joined volunteer efforts I did, found excuses to talk to my mother at the grocery store line. He called me love of my life once in a message, and I felt the letters as a strike across my face. I didn't want to make him the villain in my life, but he wouldn't let go. One evening, a week after I told him not to contact me again, I was home alone. My father was working a night shift, my mother was out of town. I was making dinner and listening to the radio when there was a knock at the door, a hard, impatient rap. I looked through the peephole. A figure stood in the semi-dark of the driveway, the wood line behind him swallowing his lower half in shadow. For a moment, my heart misread him as someone I knew. Then, Austin's face filled the frame of the peephole. I told him through the door to leave, to go. He apologized at first, said he just wanted to talk. I told him no and kept the chain on. He pushed. I felt the impact through the wood. He forced the door open and swung at me in a way that I still can't replay without the sound of a thud in my ears. I got one arm between us and felt the sudden, jagged pain when he lunged a knife. I'm not going to describe the cut in detail. It's enough to say I was injured and bleeding and afraid. My father came running from the garage at the sound of our struggle. He grabbed Austin and pulled him away. Austin fled before the police arrived. He was arrested later, pulled in from a road near the woods where he'd been seen stepping into shadow. When the officers read him his rights, he smiled the way someone smiles at a private joke. I watched him being led away in cuffs and felt a small, empty relief that was not the end of anything, only a pause. He was convicted and sentenced. Those are the facts the court record reaffirmed. I don't repeat the sentence length because that detail is not for me to invent. What I will say is that his conviction did not unmake the aftermath. The nights I flinched, the conversations about safety, the way my friends insisted on coming over to check that my locks had been changed. I moved for a while. I spent months in therapy learning to trust that people could be kind without wanting something in return. I learned to let someone stand on my porch for a second and walk away without my body anticipating harm. The legal result mattered, yes, it mattered a great deal because a person who crossed into violence was removed from the immediate geography of my life. But it did not erase the memory of the woods around my house, the place where he had once stood with a camera snapping images of me like I was a subject in an exhibit. Traumas are not tidy. They don't close when a gavel falls. They settle into the small practices of every day. I never sleep with the bedroom curtains open at night. I don't walk the yard in the dark alone. I answer the door only when someone I expect has called first. Host voice, with measured gravity. 8 accounts. 8 small geographies of unease. Not every thread ties cleanly into another, but together they make a pattern. Places on the edge of trees where ordinary warnings blur, where technology becomes unreliable, where the familiar turns into something that watches. There are common elements. Voices on radios, lights that shouldn't be on, footprints that stop, smears on windowsills, a knock that won't quit. You might expect a single explanation to fold them all up neatly. A stray predator, an enterprising thief ring, a series of pranks. Some accounts fit those boxes. Others refuse them. The central fact remains. Forest edges are thresholds. They muffle sound and make geometry unreliable. They are where roads lose their shoulders, where houses swap their lights for shadow, where radios hiss like a human throat. For the people who told us their stories, the worst thing wasn't always the immediate danger. It was the slow, long-term retuning of their lives to a new frequency of watching. Mark left the ranger service, stripped of the belief the forest could be read cleanly. The college students at the cove stopped trusting the glow of a distant light. The siblings who watched a man near their yard learned the lengths to which preparation can go without a guarantee. Hannah and Bunny left a house with a bolted door and took with them a knowledge that odd noises might be an argument. Eric sold his home and carried the image of that 2 a.m. wave. Lewis quit night shifts and let his hands remember the feel of a steering wheel tightened to the point of pain. Sophia, at 14, learned how small, loud a knock can be. Claire had the person she once trusted become the person who tried to take her life. A conviction did not stitch the wound itself. We present these accounts without a claim about the supernatural. We do not assert that the tree line is a living thing with plans. We also do not casually dismiss the things people have reported. Devices fail in the dark. People do cruel things. Sometimes the evidence points to nothing more than human malintent, and sometimes it points to something that escapes easy explanation. That ambiguity is part of what keeps us up at night. It is part of what keeps these stories alive. If you've lived through something like any of these, if the woods at the edge of your life have taught you a new kind of caution, tell us about it. We read every submission and sometimes use anonymous accounts in future episodes. Share it in the comments or use the submission link in the description. We want to keep this a space where people can talk about what they've seen and felt without judgment. Host voice, final reflection. The trees are patient. They keep their small sounds and the small things that happen at their borders. They will not speak unless we listen. If the woods have been a boundary in your life, if they have been the place where a knock arrived, where a light came on and a silhouette waved, remember that nothing is finished in one night. The forest holds traces that we carry into the daylight. Thank you for listening to these 8 real encounters in the woods, stories too disturbing to explain neatly. If you were affected by any of this tonight, please take care of yourself. Step into a bright room. Call a friend. If you want to hear more stories like these, subscribe and explore our playlist of witness accounts. We'll keep listening, and we'll keep bringing these voices forward.